Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you're watching this. I really appreciate you tuning in to watch the Sunday School from Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church as we make our way through the entire Bible in an overview, a jet plane overview. And today we're going to look at 2 Samuel. But before I look at that, I wanted to show you something. This is a book called The First Testament, and it's translated by John Goldingay, Goldingay. It is the most literal version of what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. It's the most literal translation that you will ever see in your life. It's not a Bible that you would want to read out loud to a crowd of people, but it's a wonderful study Bible if you want to get as close as you can to the Hebrew text without reading Hebrew. So I'm not making a cut on that or anything. I just think it's a wonderful, wonderful tool. And if you happen to have a few extra shekels lying around, you can get it from Amazon, and it's a very, very nice tool. So let's think today about 2 Samuel. Remember that at the end of 1 Samuel, we ended with Saul going to see the witch of Endor. And the witch told him he was going to die, and Saul then committed suicide as a result of that. We begin the book of 2 Samuel with David being the king. And David is one of the great kings, if not the greatest king that Israel has ever known. Even later on, during what is called the intertestamental period, there are times when they long for Israel to go back to the time when David was king and all was right with the land. So 2 Samuel, the theme is David, and you could see David there between two sand mules. That is, David is in between two Samuels, reminding us of 2 Samuel. And as opposed to Saul, David actually has a heart because he is a man after God's own heart. We'll see that later on. He is playing a lyre, because you remember this instrument called a lyre was one of the things that David played to calm Saul down when Saul had problems. He's wearing a crown to remind us that he's a king, and he's carrying a sling to remind us that even as a little boy, he was fighting the battles for God. And while he had a heart for God, he also had a variety of problems, and we know about that. Even though he was Israel's greatest king, he also had a personal life that was beset with issues that it shouldn't have been. And he was everything from a lustful looking person to a person committing adultery to ultimately a person committing murder. And so let's look at this life of David and see that God uses even the most imperfect of his servants. One of the things that we realize about the Bible is that it tells us not just the good things about people. If you read a lot of biographies, and indeed even autobiographies, they will tell you only the great things that the person has done. And yet the Bible is biographical in many instances, and it always tells us not just the good things that the person has done, but the bad things that the person has done, to remind us that God works with imperfect instruments. So one of the things that David does is restore Israel. David restores Israel, and we see that in 2 Samuel chapter 29, that ultimately David is responsible by the power of God for restoring the nation of Israel. He says, "Indeed, you are my lamp, O Lord. The Lord lightens my darkness. By you I can crush a troop and by my God I can leap over a wall. This God, his way is perfect. The promise of the Lord proves true. He is a shield to all who take refuge in him. So David realizes that all true light, all true protection comes from not ourselves, not from the army, but it comes from God himself. In terms of the outline of this book of 2 Samuel, to give us an overview as we look at it, the key theme is the restoration of Israel by God's power through David. And you can look up the key verse, we just read it a moment ago. David unites the people in verses 1 through 7, in chapters 1 through 7. Remember that Saul has ended up by basically destroying whatever unity Israel had. He is a horrible king at the end of his life. David comes back in and he unites the people. He is a new king in chapters 1 through chapters 5. They realize that with the death of Saul, they need a new king, and David is anointed that new king. And there is a new capital city. He makes the city of Jerusalem the new capital city. There's a new dynasty that happens, and that is the Davidic dynasty. And we will see David and his son Solomon continuing the work of God. David expands the borders of Israel. That's one of the things that makes the country strong. David is able to expand the borders so those who try to come in and overrun Israel are unable to do so. He defeats Israel's enemies in chapter 8 and in chapter 10. He organizes the kingdom in chapter 8. He honors Mephibosheth. If we had lots of time here, we would talk about Mephibosheth and what Mephibosheth means and what was going on there. Because Mephibosheth is a very, very important figure, both here in the life of David and in the book of Hebrews. It seems as if from Abraham to David to the book of Hebrews, Mephibosheth is what we call a Christological figure. He is a figure who is Christ appearing in human form before he was born as the child Jesus, the Messiah. David, though, doesn't always do what he should have. And in chapter 11, we get to this point where David disobeys the Lord, does what he shouldn't. And we'll spend some time talking about that because David sins and Amon sins later on. So there are a number of real serious problems in this book of 2 Samuel with the leaders. Absalom sins, David's son, you remember. And then finally David returns to Jerusalem. He's been driven out by those who hate him, some of which were his own family. Then finally, in the third part of the book, David closes his reign. He ends up with this final, as an old man, this final battles that he needs to fight. He shows respect for Saul, despite the fact that Saul had done what he shouldn't have, despite the fact that Saul had ended up his life in virtual disgrace. David still shows respect for Saul. But he also defeats the Philistines, which was very, very important for the future of the nation of Israel. He praises the Lord. David was a warrior, and being a warrior, he fought the wars for God. He honored his mighty men, those men who were his army. He honored them for fighting for him. And he bought a site for the temple, the Davidic temple that was built there on the Mount of Jerusalem. And so we realize from that there are some amazing things going on in this book of 2 Samuel. Some things that we would never, ever, ever think that ought to be going on. And so we want to ask ourselves, what practical things do we learn from 2 Samuel? Because after all, at the end of the day, if the book doesn't tell us some things about ourselves, if the book doesn't tell us some ways that we would be better off, either in our worship or in our actions, then there's something wrong. So here are some practical things that we learn from the book of 2 Samuel. One is that Saul tore things apart, but God, through David, put them back together. If we were to end the history of Israel with 1 Samuel, we would say that Israel and its king and its army ended in disgrace. But it didn't, because that's not where the story ends. And it's important for all of us to remember that when we face trouble in our own life, that's not where the story ends. You remember that old movie called The World's Best Exotic Marigold Hotel. And they look at this brochure of a wonderful, wonderful hotel. They get there and the place is run down and everything is broken. And they go to the person at the desk. And the person at the desk says to them, "We have a saying here in India, everything will be all right in the end. If it's not yet all right, then it's not yet the end." That is the message of the Bible. That is what theologians call eschatology, that ultimately God is going to put everything right in a new heaven and a new earth. We also learn that David did not always have an easy time. There were times when people, his own family, wanted him gone out of the kingship. We learn that David committed some very serious sin, the sin of adultery and the sin of murder. The person whom God had placed in the highest office in the land committed adultery and committed murder. And that reminds us that God uses imperfect people to do great things. Now, we ought not to make ourselves imperfect or to intentionally go out and sin and do things wrong, hoping that God will use our imperfections. No, we shouldn't do that. But we should know that whatever mistakes we have made, whatever things we have done wrong, that God can still use us, that there is time for redemption. Just like the judge Samson, whose whole life was wrong, and yet at the end of his life he prays and God comes to him and he destroys Philistines. God redeems him at the end in spite of his own flaws. And we should remember that no situation, personal or national, no situation is beyond God's ability to repair. And so I might be speaking to someone who's saying to themselves, I've done things that God can't use me anymore, or I've done things that God can't forgive. And I'm here to say to you that Jesus Christ will not turn you away if you come to him and ask for forgiveness. So let's think about this great sin that David committed and ask ourselves what exactly happened and how did this go wrong? What happened to David's great sin? In 2 Samuel 11, this is essentially what happened. David sent someone to inquire about the woman. David, in verses 1 and 2, was up on his roof. The king's roof was high and could look over the whole city. And as he's up on his roof, he sees a woman, probably a young woman, maybe as young as 15 or 16 years old. She didn't have a child, and her husband was away at war fighting for David. And he sees this woman, and she is incredibly beautiful. And so, in verse 3, David sent someone to inquire about the woman, and it was reported, this is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. And so David sent messengers to get her. And she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period, and then she returned to her house. Every detail that the Old Testament tells us has some significance. It's as if the heart of David is being x-rayed, like we see the x-ray there on the slide. And we realize that David has a particular weakness, virtually the same weakness that Samson had, a weakness for beautiful women. And this was a young woman in all likelihood. And the Old Testament prophet tells us, or historian tells us, that she was purifying herself so that we will know that she doesn't have another child. But then what happened? What did David do? David disobeyed exactly what God had told him to do. He disobeyed by looking at the woman, by desiring the woman, and by taking the woman. If we look at the first chapter of the book of James, that lays out for us the way that temptation works. And we look, we desire, and then we take. David not only disobeyed, but David deceived. What happened was that David realized that Bathsheba came back and said to David, I'm pregnant. And all of a sudden, David realizes he's in a very serious situation. He's gotten another man's wife pregnant. As a result of that, he says, listen, to his general, he says, well, first he calls Uriah back from the army, thinking that Uriah will sleep with his wife and thus the child will be thought to be his. But what happens is Uriah will not go inside and sleep with his wife. He sleeps outside on the doorstep. And David says to Uriah, what's wrong with you? I've brought you back. Why are you sleeping outside on the doorstep? And Uriah says, I will not go inside and sleep in my own bed with my own wife while my brothers are outside fighting a war. So David realizes he's in serious trouble. So he says to his general, this is what I want you to do. I want you to take Uriah and put him in the hottest point of the battle, the place in the battle where there's a lot of killing. And then I want you to order all the rest of the troops to fall back, but don't tell Uriah. And Uriah then dies on the battlefield as a direct result of the lie that was perpetuated by David. But David didn't get away with his sin. He was disciplined for it. God doesn't just let sin go away. He disciplines it. That's the reason that Moses stood on the mountain looking into the promised land as the rest of Israel marched into there. And so let's look for a second at these three things that David did: disobeyed, deceived, and was disciplined. First of all, David disobeyed. The conceiving of the sin was one evening David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of his palace, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing. Now, this woman was very attractive. And so David, rather than recognizing that he shouldn't be looking at this private event that was going on the roof, and by the way, the roof was where a lot of events like this took place so that no one could see them. It was only probably because David's palace was high that he could see that. And so he decided that that was the woman that he wanted. And he was the king. There was nothing that the woman could do. You really can't blame her. She came to by a group of soldiers and said, "The king wants to see you." Well, what else can she do? Then David, after conceiving the sin, he committed the sin. David sent some of his messengers to get her, and she came with him, and he had sexual relations with her. That's the disobedience of David, but it continues. David then tries to cover up the sin. After he conceives it and commits it, he tries to cover it up. In the morning, and this is after he finds out that Bathsheba is pregnant, and that Uriah won't go in and sleep with his wife while the battle is still going on. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. These were sealed orders. Uriah didn't know what was in those orders. And they were orders for his own death. In the letter, the secret orders, he wrote, "Station Uriah in the thick of the battle, and then withdraw from him so that he will be cut down and killed." That is murder. There is no doubt that David conceived of that in his mind for the specific point of having Uriah the Hittite, who had no children of his own, having her husband killed, just so that he could have the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba. But we should realize that David didn't just cover the sin, but he also confessed the sin. Nathan, who is a prophet, comes to David and he tells him a story. He said, "What would you think of a man who had only one little lamb, and another man who had a whole flock of sheep? And that man who had a whole flock of sheep killed the man with one lamb so that he could take that lamb from him." And David becomes very angry and said, "That man ought to be punished terribly." And that's when we hear this famous line. Nathan says, "You are the man. You've killed Uriah when you had plenty of other women, and he only had that one small lamb." Finally, David confesses, and he says to Nathan, "I have sinned against the Lord." That's a terrible disobedience that David was involved in. Yet, even though he confessed, David was chastised for the sin. God punished him for the sin. In the text, then Nathan went to his home. The Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife had borne to David, and the child became very ill. So the child that had been conceived between David and Bathsheba had been born. And Nathan the prophet went there, and the Lord struck the child, and the child got very sick. And on the seventh day, the child died. Now, there's an interesting passage in this chapter. David is on his face fasting and praying while the child is sick. And yet, when the child dies, he gets up, he washes his face, and he starts to eat. And his servants say, "Why were you so sad when the child is sick, but you get up when the child dies?" And he says, He cannot come back to me, but I can go to him. Indicating to us that David believed that that child was taken by God to be with God. And since David would one day also be with God, he would be with that child. It's not absolute proof of the fact that infants that die in infancy go to be with God. But I think it nudges us in that direction. And there are other passages in the text that nudge us even farther in that direction to show us that infants who die in infancy, as the confession says, go to be with God. So this is a chastening by God. The child dies. But then, in spite of the sin that David has committed, God comforts him. And so the text says, so David comforted his wife, Bathsheba. He went to her and had marital relations with her, and she gave birth to a son, and David named him Solomon. And now the Lord loved the child. You all, of course, are familiar with Solomon, and we will talk more about Solomon as the weeks go on. But one of the things to remember is that Solomon comes from the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace or peace be on you. If you've ever been to Israel, the form of greeting is to say to someone, shalom, peace be on you. And so David's son, Solomon, is a son to remind them that in spite of the troubles that they have, in spite of the problems that they are facing, God still loves them and they still have peace. Psalm 51 is a record of David's sorrow. It's a record of David's repentance. And so he says, have mercy on me, O God, because of your loyal love. Because of your great compassion, wipe away my rebellious acts. Wash away my wrongdoing. Cleanse me of my sin, for I am aware of my rebellious acts. I am forever conscious of my sin. Against you above all, I have sinned, and I have done what is evil in your sight. So you are just when you confront me. You are right when you condemn me. David is saying in the 51st Psalm, God, you are right to punish me. You could kill me now, and you would be right in doing that. But I'm asking because of your mercy and because of your loyal love that you will continue to use me in spite of the terrible issues that I've been involved in. Let's end this study of 2 Samuel with a couple of amazing facts. One amazing fact is that in the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1, there are 4 women mentioned. Now that's unusual in and of itself, 4 women plus Mary, so total of 5. That's unusual in and of itself. Women were rarely mentioned in genealogy. But the amazing thing is that the wife of Uriah is mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Bathsheba, who became the spouse of David under less than honorable conditions because of David. And yet, in spite of all that, she is still in the genealogy of Christ. One last amazing fact that we should remember, and that is that God loved David in spite of David's sin. In the book of Acts, the preacher says, God raised up David their king. He testified about him. I have found David, the son of Jesse, to be a man after my heart, who will accomplish everything I want him to do. David was a man after God's own heart, in spite of the sin that he had committed. And I speak today to you as a sinner. And I speak to you today as people who are sinners. And yet I speak to you not without hope, but I speak to you from the hope that David had. And that was the hope of a God who loves us and who sends his Son, Jesus Christ, to forgive us. So next week we'll be looking at the book of 1 Chronicles. We'll be moving on into the life of David and into the life of Solomon. I hope that you'll join me then. Thank you so much for watching Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church Sunday School, and I hope that this has been a great blessing to you.